Welcome to IVF This, episode 139, IVF and Fighting for Your Pain. Hello, 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 beautiful friends. I hope you are all doing so well. I'm really excited to talk about this topic today because it it comes up a lot, I should say. Let me start out with this. It comes up a lot, but the idea for this particular podcast episode sprang from a conversation that I had with my client, or one of my clients, sprang from a conversation I had with one of my clients about how she really felt like her body had failed her because by the time this conversation had occurred, she had had 3 failed embryo transfers. And I know that even without the failed embryo transfers, most of us can understand that idea of my body is failing, right? If I had a nickel for every time someone or even I thought, my body it's supposed to do this one thing, just this one thing, and it can't do it, right? Which is ridiculous because your body does millions of things every second that it's functioning. But we do have this very strong cultural belief that if my body could just do this one thing. And so I think this idea of my body betrayed me or my body is failing me, both of those ideas are incredibly painful. Both of those beliefs are incredibly painful. And yet, so when we go through the litany of examples that she offered me about how her body had failed her, she gave me, her uterus, which didn't have any structural issues in it or anything like that, right? Her body, just in general, her goodness, her ability, her lovability, her deservedness to carry a child, all of those things, right? Toxins, exercising, not exercising enough, her diet, did she make enough changes? Did she make too many changes? Should she be wearing socks to keep her uterus warm, right? In Chinese medicine, having cold feet means you have a cold uterus because there's meridian lines and, all of these things, like so on, back and forth. And every time I would try to challenge her on some of these thoughts, right? Like, has anyone ever told you that your weight needs to be lower or your weight needs to be higher, right? I don't want to give some specific examples about her away, but I think just in general, right? We have these very, very solid, very concrete preconceived notions as to what we do and what we do wrong. But every time I would challenge her specifically and maybe try to offer an alternative explanation or an alternative belief, she would like go right back into her magic hat and pull out a whataboutism, right? Well, what about this? And what about that? And that is what I call fighting for your pain. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about the 3 big reasons that I think that we fight for our pain. And I'm going to give you 3-ish questions that I want you to ask yourself either in your brain and you're just kind of thinking like just a thought exercise, or whether you're spending time journaling on it. Either way, there's no right or wrong, but just to give you something to think about, to try to pull apart a little bit of that like vice grip that this pain has over you. Okay. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, a lot of this stuff can be universally applied. It doesn't just have to be around IVF. It can be about relationships, right? Familial relationships or romantic relationships, work, friendships, infertility and IVF, of course, is the context for what we're talking about. But I don't want you to think that you just have to stick with this. You can apply this to any aspect of your life that you feel like you're holding on to pain. So no matter the thing that happened or didn't happen, you didn't want it to happen or not happen, right? You play the scene over and over and over in your mind. It's pure agony, right? And I can remember still viscerally in September of 2020 when one of our transfers failed and I could hear the medical assistant's voice, right? I can still hear it in my head, that tone. And if you know, the tone that many of us know, and I pray that a lot of you never have to know, but it's the one that always starts with, I'm so sorry to tell you this, but anguish, right? And we think that that's the most painful it's going to get. But for many of us, it's not. The most painful is the hours and the days and the weeks and the months and sometimes the years that follow. It's the mental chatter about our failures and how hopeless we are, and just our overwhelming sense of doom and gloom for the rest of our lives, right? That feeling that nothing good is going to happen for us. And that circulates and spins in our head from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, if we even sleep sometimes. I didn't even sleep at night many times because those thoughts just kept circling in my head, and all the times in between. And it doesn't even feel like we get a reprieve. And for some of us with some losses, even those moments of reprieve are painful. Because how could we be enjoying this other thing when that thing happened, right? And that's another added layer that complicates grief. And grief is already a complicated experience. So why do we hold on to it so much? Why can't we just let it go and move on? Because God knows that's the thing that people tell us, right? You just got to let it go. Thank you for that detailed analysis. And would you mind providing me a blueprint for how to do that? No? Thank you. Then I will take that under advisement. Just let it go. I don't know why I haven't thought of that yet, right? That's similarly akin to you just try and relax. Thank you. You should write for Hallmark because that is just so motivational and inspiring. It's incredible, right? But why do we hold on to that hurt so much? And this is not an exhaustive list. In fact, you could Google why we hold on to our pain and you're going to come up with 50 different articles outlining 50 different reasons. These are the things and the themes that I've seen working with IVFers and going through infertility and everything that I've experienced in my life as well, right? So the first and foremost is that you're afraid of the unknown. Whether it's consciously or unconsciously, we're afraid of the unknown. And when I tell you that there is a reason that our brain holds on to this, and I talk about that extensively in the podcast episode called the negativity bias, how our brain mostly perceives things that we experience and things that we go through in a negative light. And it does that, it's done that for an entirety of our evolution. It helps us to kind of be prepared. And I'm going to talk about that in the second one. But there's a reason our brain does it. It's very useful and has been for millennia for us to kind of stave off danger and be prepared and things like that, right? It's not necessarily super applicable by today's standards because we don't have the same environmental dangers that we did 100 years ago, thousands of years ago, because we don't have the same threats that we did then, but the same mechanism functions that way, right? And so our brain will always choose a hell that's familiar than the possibility of an unfamiliar heaven. I'm going to say that one more time for everybody. Your brain will choose a familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven. Okay? By the only virtue of it being familiar. If you've heard any of these podcast episodes before, you know that I talk a lot about safety and certainty and how those two things coexist all of the time. And so if something is familiar, even if it's terrible, even if it's painful, even if it is hell, our brain will hold on to it because it's familiar. Literally the only reason our brain will hold on to something is because it's familiar. Okay? Now, you might be asking, well, Emily, why the hell is that true? That seems like a ridiculous party trick that our brain should never play on us. But the emotions that are associated most with loss are adrenaline and cortisol, right? Whenever you have that like grief burst or whenever you feel that really overwhelming surge of emotion, a lot of that is adrenaline and cortisol. And our brain can become kind of addicted to the cortisol and adrenaline dump that occurs. And so the more that happens, because grief will just dump adrenaline and cortisol on you all day, every day. And so the more that happens, the more familiar our brain becomes with it. The more familiar our brain is with it, the more likely it is going to happen over and over and over again, right? And that is not a morality or a virtue issue. That is a biological issue. That is a biological function, right? So if that's what's happening for you, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. It means your brain is functioning the way it was designed to function. It just doesn't really serve you in that way. Okay? So letting go can be absolutely terrifying, right? The idea of not having this pain to our brain feels like, well, that means that we're just opening ourselves up to a whole other ton of pain that we might experience. That is terrifying, right? At least this pain that I've cultivated and nurtured and carried with me for years and years and years, at least I know what to expect. If I let it go and I have to experience a new kind of pain, well, I don't know what to expect and I might just die. And I know that you might think well, that's ridiculous, but that is the unconscious thought process that our brain has, because our brain only has 3 motivations: to keep us safe, to find pleasure in things, and to be as efficient as possible, right? Safety doesn't mean peace to our brain. Safety doesn't mean calm. Safety doesn't mean anxiety free. It just means free from physical danger. Because our brain doesn't really differentiate between psychological and physical safety or danger. It just interprets it all as danger or safety, right? And so that's the primary thing that I see, is that it's just familiar. And I've talked about this with probably every single one of my clients, right? Hundreds of women that I've talked to over these last several years, is that not a lot of these things, like I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm a piece of crap, whatever that common theme is, that commonly held belief that you have in your brain, it didn't just materialize when you started encountering infertility or going through IVF. It didn't just magically pop up. You have probably carried this with you for most of your life, right? So while it might have a different flavor right now, it's probably not new. And that's what I mean by familiar. Because if you were told, you're too much, that's a really common one. You're too much, you're too emotional. Oh my gosh, you're too emotional. From the time that you're 5, then when you're going through IVF and infertility, and you're a normal human being experiencing emotion, then clearly that's going to be too much, right? It's a painful thought. It's a familiar thought, something that we're going to hold on to. So letting go of that level of familiarity, letting go of that comfort, put air quotes around comfort because it's not necessarily comfortable, but it's the comfort of familiarity, can be a very scary proposition. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2 is we believe that our pain can protect us. And the idea is really simple, right? And you can track it logically. If I hold on to this pain, I can keep it from ever happening again. And when you think about some of the worst experiences of your life, some of the darkest, the most painful, sometimes you're barely functioning as a result of that pain. So much so that becomes almost a red flag for you. And that if I put so much pressure on myself to be hypervigilant, I can maybe prevent this thing from happening again, which is kind of ridiculous for IVF, because you don't have any control over the outcome, right? And I don't mean ridiculous as in you're ridiculous, but the false control that we think that we have over this process, right? If I do X and Y and Z, right? If you've ever taken a logic class, right? If A is true and B is true and C is true, then that will equal D, right? So if I take all my medicines and I go to my doctor's appointments and I do everything that I'm told, then that will guarantee a baby. Except it doesn't work like that. And the fact that strays so far from what we understand logic and what we understand, right? If I work really hard at this, then I'm going to get it. It doesn't make sense, which is why it can be so, the only word I'm thinking of is discombobulating, because that's how it felt, right? Out of control, almost like I was going to come out of my skin, because I just needed that control so much, but it's just an illusion. I never had control of the outcome. I do have control, right? I do get to decide how I think, what I feel, and what I'm going to do. But everything else, the things that I, want control over more than anything in this world, I don't have control over. Right? So it's this faulty logic of, well, if I can control for these things, then maybe I get to control for the outcome. But you don't. And that's where we get into that idea of emotional cushioning. And I have a whole podcast episode around emotional cushioning, but it's this idea of, well, if I tell myself it's not going to work, even if I'm going through the steps, then that is somehow going to minimize or mitigate the pain that I'm going to experience. But it doesn't. It doesn't. It never does. It might feel that way, and it gives you that sense of control, right? Because you're telling yourself, I can't get ahead of myself. Don't count your chickens before they hatch. I'm not there yet. I just can't feel that way, right? If we can get to create that emotional distance, that's us doing it. We have the control. We have the power, which that's why it feels so elusive to say, well, I don't want to get my hopes up or anything like that. But if the thing is going to happen and you're going to be devastated no matter what, like, don't kid yourself. You're going to be devastated whether you told yourself not to get your hopes up or not. If you weren't going to be devastated, you probably wouldn't be going through this, right? It wouldn't be important enough for you to put yourself, your mind, your body, your spirit, your finances. It wouldn't be important enough for you to go through with this. So if you're going to be devastated either way, the comfortable, the familiar would be to create distance, to have pain ahead of time, a familiar pain, rather than trying to hold on or thinking about hope or excitement, which feels unfamiliar. Because maybe up until now you haven't had any experience that helped you channel or access that hope or that excitement. And so we do believe, and it's reinforced to us, that if I can hold on to it, if I can hold on to this pain, then I don't have to feel that way ever again, right? I might feel like pain adjacent, diet pain, but I don't have to ever go through that really terrible, terrible pain again. So then the third one, because I realize I want to get through these so that we can get to the question, but the third one is that when we are holding onto that pain, we actually have access to more powerful emotions. And what I mean by is this: grief sucks. Sadness sucks. It feels hopeless. It feels helpless. It feels so vulnerable. But you know what feels more powerful? Anger. Feeling justified, incensed about what's going on and why and what's happening for you. And someone may have wronged you, or the clinic, or, you get to blame something or someone. Those are more powerful feelings, not better feelings. It's not a question of gradation, like good, better, best. It's a different type of feeling, right? Where sadness and grief feels very vulnerable and very helpless. Anger, bitterness, resentment, those feel more powerful, right? We can get a lot of leverage from those emotions, and they're not good or bad. Emotions just are, right? And there are going to be some times, right? Grief work cannot be done all of the time, right? It's not something that you can just power through. It's something that has to happen organically. The only way out is through. You have to go through it. But there are going to be times when maybe you don't want to. And so that anger and that resentment, maybe even jealousy, those are going to be really important emotions for you to pull from so that you don't have to feel the sadness and the grief and those really heavy emotions. And that's not good or bad, right? That's just being a human and vacillating between those two, right? But that powerful emotion is also kind of intoxicating. Right? Well, if that other feeling, if that grief and that sadness sucks because it's so heavy and it's like just trying to trudge through mud or molasses or something, and this one I get to feel powerful and I get to feel, ugh, right? They don't feel good. They just feel different. And so the other one can feel very intoxicating. And so there can be a reason to hold on to that. We call that secondary gain, right? There are other aspects of secondary gain to what we're talking about, but that's one of them, right? I get to trade out this emotion for this emotion. Man, that emotion feels more empowering, so I'm going to stick with that one, and I'm just going to try and bury the sadness and the grief over here, right? So those are the three, right? We're afraid of kind of the unknown, right? Our brain will choose a familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven. We believe that our pain can protect us, and we get to choose more powerful feelings, right? So those are the three reasons why we hold on to our pain. And remember, it's not an exhaustive list. If one of those feels less true than the other, that's totally fine. You can do your own research on that. There are a lot of reasons, and a lot of really smart people have put together reasons why we think we hold on to our pain. Those are just the ones that I see thematically that come up a lot for my clients. But as I promised you, I'm going to offer you 3 questions that if you think about them and you spend a little time on them and really kind of let them sink in, what it can do, it can start to just peel away, right? Loosen the ketchup bottle, if you will, on some of your pain. So here's the 3 questions. The first one is, are there secondary gains that you're getting by holding on to your pain? Right? Do I get to feel powerful? And do I get to stay in an unfamiliar hell because the prospect of something else feels more terrifying, right? Do I get to create more distance, right, from what I'm actually feeling, right? The excitement and the hope feels so dangerous that if I hold on to my pain, then I don't have to feel that danger. I get to feel something else. The second question is staying in your pain keeping you from relationships and situations? Now, a very common thought for us is no one understands. Now, I'm not saying that that isn't true to some degree or another, but I think that we hold on to this because grief in and of itself shrinks our world. It can be very isolating. And so it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Maybe people don't have to totally understand you to love you. Maybe they don't have to totally get it. And I think everybody listening to this podcast knows what I mean when I say get it. Maybe they don't have to totally get it to walk through it with you, right? I have to tell you this, me, your coach, I might not ever truly understand what you're going through, what you have gone through, what you're feeling and what you're thinking. I may never understand. Now I have skills. I have a metric ton of empathy, and I have a full-on give 'em hell attitude. But I will never know exactly what you're thinking, why you're thinking, the experiences that you've had. But it doesn't mean that I can't be there for you. It doesn't mean that I can't help you and that I can't care for you. Multiple things can be true at the same time. I don't have to have walked through your shoes or walked in your shoes to help you through this process. And I think that the same can be true for the people that we love and the people that love us. And the third question is, are you avoiding resolving this pain because you would have to face it first? Now, what would it mean for you to face it? And I think for a lot of us, we either think that we're going to fall into a hole and never be able to climb out, or we're going to open like Pandora's box and never be able to close it. I think those are 2 pretty common things when we talk about like grief or sadness or doing a lot of what we feel like is like really super deep work. And that's not entirely true. But I think that it's understandable why we fear it so much, because it hurts, because it sucks. It's terrible. Why would we want to actively pursue something that feels terrible, right? What are you afraid is going to look back at you if you were to take a look at this? What are you afraid to see? What would it mean for you to look? What would you gain or lose by taking a peek? Because I guarantee you, the thing that we fear we're going to find is only ever a thought. It's only ever a thought. Maybe they were right. That's usually the one that comes to me. Maybe they were right. Maybe I am a whatever, XYZ. The thing that I'm most terrified about. Maybe I'm never going to get this thing. Maybe I'm never going to get to hold a baby. Maybe I'm never going to have the family that I want. Maybe I was never truly worthy or good enough. Those aren't objective facts. They're questions at best, neither rooted in reality or fact. So if the worst thing that can happen is you have a thought that creates a feeling, well, if you're already in a familiar hell, is it really going to get worse? Or is there a possibility of it getting better? Because I got to tell you, now, after doing this work for as long as I have and talking with you all and just literally doing my own work, the prospect of something better or just feeling different, having it be less painful, that is a far greater consequence that I'm willing to accept than more of the same. And I have a sneaking suspicion that if you're listening to this podcast and you've made it all the way to the end of this episode, that is something that you feel too. That prospect could just be enough to help through this. When we start to answer these questions, you get to start to looking at your pain in a different way, right? Not where it's personalized, not where it's about you, not where it's, a confirmation of all the terrible things that you believe about yourself. It doesn't mean it's going to be flipped like an on-off switch and you're never going to have pain again in your life. That's never the goal, right? The goal is to not suffer. Pain is inevitable. Suffer is optional. But it doesn't mean that your pain doesn't get to hide in the dark anymore. That's when our pain hides in the dark, that's like giving your pain a free pass to just lay around and do nothing. Right? That is a freeloading SOB right there. It doesn't have to do anything but just live and grow. No. Everybody pays rent. Shit. Everybody has to pay rent. And so does your pain. And if your pain has to pay rent, then what's the cost? What's the rent? The rent is we got to take a look at it. We got to think about it. We got to challenge it. Is it true? No, probably not. Switch the light on. Or, if that feels too aggressive, just open the dimmer a little bit, right? Whatever feels most comfortable and most doable for you. There's no right or wrong way, but we can't let it have a free pass anymore. No freeloaders anymore. No more. I was doing a podcast episode one time, and I'm just going to close out with this story. And someone asked me if I was ever afraid about putting myself or my work, my content out into the world, like my fear of rejection. And of course I'm afraid of rejection. I'm a human being. But also not really. And the reason that I came to that is because no one could ever be as mean to myself as I have been. No one. So if that's the benchmark, like if you have been a level of asshole to yourself that no one could ever even consider reaching, then all you have is games. You get to choose, right? Because if that inner critic that screams and screeches and berates, if that is the thing that we can get under control, then nothing can hold you back. And that is the gift I want you guys to have. That your pain doesn't have to be inevitable. And it doesn't have to stay with you. Right? There's a difference between carrying grief and being in pain all of the time. And the only way we can get to the carrying part is through this part. And that's all for all of you. All right. That is what I have for you, my friends. Have a beautiful week, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.